Afternoon on this cold, wintry day. I'm Laura Goldman. I'm the dietitian working with Premier Weight Loss, and welcome to today's webinar. This is a discussion on the role of carbohydrates in your energy as well as side effect management, or essentially explaining or hopefully explaining why carbs are not necessarily the enemy. And hopefully I can get you to see some of the good sides of carbs throughout this. Also, just so you're aware, this is definitely going to be a very brief explanation on the types of carbs. There is a presentation I did back in March of 2025, I believe, where I go into depth on the chemistry nature and different creations of the carbohydrates. So if you want to get into the weeds a little bit more after this, then I welcome you to listen to that. And without further ado, let's get started. So remember, as always, it's the quality of your calories that matters. And I think there's a very distinct difference when we're looking at the quality of carbohydrates, especially. We know that cookies and cakes and pastries would be on the lower end of the quality when we're talking about carbohydrates. Quality of flavor aside, of course, but the quality and how well it's going to affect you versus the quality of a more complex carbohydrate or a starchy vegetable, something like that. So this can really help focus in on what we're talking about when it comes to the quality factor. What we're covering today, again, is a brief discussion on carbohydrate types and what they do, how carbs can affect side effects, and some of the best carbohydrates to focus on, as well as which carbohydrates are best to limit. I did a couple carb fact versus fiction notes, one of which I would say is a little bit newer to the scene, or newer to at least me discussing it, and a couple of weekly challenges if you are up to that for the next week. As always, at the end, I welcome you to ask any questions by using that little question mark button on your screen. I believe it's in the bottom left. And I'm happy to answer any nutrition questions about this topic or any others that come to mind. So here's our little primer on carbohydrates. What they are, very basically speaking, they are one of the main three macronutrients our body uses to function. And it is usually the greatest percentage of our calories. You can see here on this pie chart, really, as much as we emphasize protein as being important, it takes up the smallest portion of our calories in total. Carbohydrates definitely eat up the largest portion of the pie, as long as we're not looking at specific types of diets, such as a keto diet, which would be very different. But the general typical intake looks something like this, or for some people, maybe a bit bigger on the carbohydrate side of things, to anywhere from maybe 50 to 55% of their calories. It is the primary source of energy for our bodies, and especially in our brain, in the form of glucose. And again, briefly speaking, carbohydrates are found in fruit, grains, starchy vegetables. I'd also say non-starchy vegetables in the form of fiber, which is a little bit different since fiber doesn't really have as much of a caloric impact on our intake. Quinoa, which is technically a pseudo grain, but you'll see me listed under grains a little bit later, as well as chips, crackers, cookies, and on and on. Also, types of carbohydrates. This is an area where, again, in my previous discussion, I went much more into the weeds because there's a chemical nature behind some of these definitions, whereas today I'm more or less speaking on how we broadly understand the terms. So simple or refined carbohydrates are the white bread or the pastries, cookies, sugary drinks, and I put in parentheses the sweet stuff because I think that's a decent way to think of it, but also just the plain white breads and crackers, etc., etc. Complex carbohydrates, on the other hand, are a little less broken down. Chemically, they're also a more complex structure. It's more to the whole molecule there, but they are in whole grains, legumes, as well as those starchy vegetables. And yes, even white potatoes do fall under this category. They are usually higher in fiber and they take longer to digest. All carbohydrates can affect our blood sugars, and so it's about how much we're eating and how quickly. And it depends, how much the sugar gets affected and how quickly the sugar gets affected. And that depends largely on the types that we're choosing. And to give a graphic example here with this infographic off to the left, I'm not really touching too much on the glycemic index here, but this graph shows essentially our blood glucose levels, also the time after eating different types of carbohydrates. And you can see, of course, those with a high glycemic index, which are generally coming from the simple carbohydrates, you'll see a very quick rise and a much more dramatic rise in blood sugars. Whereas the low and medium glycemic index foods, or the ones that are more complex or higher in fiber, are going to have a much slower burn. So to speak about that, of course, simple or refined carbs cause that quick fall and spike in that glucose, which can lead to cravings and overeating. And I think this is where we start to demonize carbohydrates, because we recognize that when we eat too many of these, we can also tend to overeat, and then that can lead to the weight gain or stalling our weight loss progress. So we do want to be careful because we don't want to have that storage as fat. Then also, if there's any issue with blood sugar management, if you have chronically high blood sugars, then there is that potential to have insulin resistance. And remember, GLP-1 medications are supposed to help with insulin sensitivity, but there's a chance that eating these refined carbohydrates can blunt that effectiveness and not make it as helpful. And as I'm sure you know, any added sugars are associated with chronic inflammation and cardiovascular disease. So minimizing them as much as possible. I know it can be very difficult to eliminate them altogether, but minimizing is a much better option than having those as one of our primary sources of carbs. On the other hand, as I was mentioning, complex carbs are that slow burn. They also do help promote gut health, either through fiber or resistant starches that the bacteria will digest in our gut, and that can promote the growth and livelihood of a good gut flora. Also, you're more likely to have more micronutrients from those complex carbohydrates because they haven't been completely removed by the processing or refining of them. And soluble fiber may help manage our cholesterol levels as well. So it's important to get that through our complex carbs as well. In terms of side effects, these can depend on how you do with carbs, but first of all, if you're dealing with nausea and the staying hydrated hasn't helped, and maybe you're taking something for nausea, but you'd still like to manage it with maybe some form of nutrition, because I think sometimes people can feel, or I know at least for myself, there are times where I've thought, am I hungry or am I nauseated? So sometimes having something on our stomach can make us feel better. The good news is that there are plenty of bland carbohydrates, and this is an area where even simple carbohydrates can be somewhat helpful here. So if you had saltine crackers, that can help settle the stomach, or slightly more complex if you think about the brat diet. So that's bananas, rice, applesauce, and toast. Those are also generally well regarded and well accepted to help at least with feeling a little bit better if our stomach is feeling a bit iffy. Also, fighting fatigue, and I think this is a big one. It certainly stood out to me when I was first learning about GLP-1 medications and also speaking with people who have dealt with various side effects. Fatigue is a complaint I don't want to necessarily say common, but common enough. And I believe that one of the problems is that when we are cutting out calories because of the effectiveness of the GLP-1 medications, there's a chance that we haven't had enough calories in a certain amount of time, and maybe we're having a blood sugar drop. And so having those carbohydrates can help maintain energy, but I do recommend combining it with a protein, so apple and peanut butter, just to have that slow, continuous burn and hopefully not deal with those very sudden fatigue feelings. But I do recommend combining with a protein because, of course, if you have a quick spike and fall, then that can lead to a little more of a rebound fatigue, I suppose you could think of it that way. If blood sugars are a concern, then blood sugar stability is also very helpful when combined appropriately. So have that complex carbohydrate plus a protein plus a healthy fat, and that's going to lead to a more stable glucose level in your body. And also gut health or motility. So fiber from the carbohydrates that, of course, contain fiber can help with digestion. It can help prevent constipation if you're staying adequately hydrated as well. And again, it can be a prebiotic, which helps feed that healthy gut bacteria for overall wellness and health. In terms of what to pick and what to limit, this might seem obvious on its face, but I still wanted to provide a list to offer up any ideas just very quickly. So your best choices are going to be from whole grains, which are oats, that pseudo grain quinoa that we spoke about, which is also quite high in protein, brown rice, whole wheat, and the list can go on and on with this one. Also, starchy vegetables, potatoes, squash or peas, legumes, which are lentils, chickpeas, and black beans, also a good source of protein there. And fruits. My top picks when it comes to fruits are always going to be berries. They have the highest fiber content and lowest sugar content of most any other fruit, so focus in on those if you enjoy them. Pears and apples with skin, they are also deemed to be decently high in fiber, and so those would be my top picks for you there. One thing I will mention, because I think if you've thought about this and I'm saying, well, these are your best choices, but at the same time, you're thinking, but you only tell me to fill my plate with a quarter of the carbohydrates. That's correct. So even though we're focusing on these, we don't want these to necessarily take up the entire plate, as it were. Granted, some of these, like the legumes or the quinoa, since those do have protein in them, then that can have a little bit more of a spread on your plate, so to speak. So it's not necessarily just a quarter of your plate there. But that is why, even though potatoes are a complex carb and have plenty of nutrients and are healthy, it's important to keep it in those small amounts, because where we go wrong often is just overdoing it. Also limit, of course, those white breads or pastries. I mentioned sugary cold cereals. I often refer to most breakfast cereals as candy bars in a box. So this is why there is quite a bit of processing and simplification of the carbs. Not all of them, but a decent amount, as well as sugar sweetened beverages and even fruit juice. And I mentioned the fruit juice because what tends to happen is that it's concentrating a lot of the sugary sweetness of the fruit while still eliminating the fiber that you might get from, say, pulp or from the skin if you're eating a whole fruit. Also, a cup of orange juice can be equivalent to almost 2 or 3 whole oranges in terms of calories and carbohydrate content. So it's one of those items that can get out of hand very quickly. Doing a little Mythbusters or fact versus fiction. Of course, the number one that we might hear is that carbs stop or impede our weight loss. And this is false. Ultimately, regardless of how many or how few carbohydrates you're eating, weight loss does come from a calorie deficit overall. However, like I've mentioned earlier, it's maybe easier to eat or overeat carbohydrates, especially simple ones. Oftentimes we can't stop at just one cookie. So it's one of those areas where it can very quickly get out of hand. Also, for people who have followed the keto diet, part of the initial weight loss that they might see that is very dramatic tends to be water weight. Carbohydrates, when stored as glycogen in our bodies, hold on to a bit of water. And so if we're going into ketosis, there's going to be a pretty dramatic loss of glycogen stores and water. And that being said, if you are taking a GLP-1 medication and also getting too few carbs, that, like I mentioned, that can lead to that ketone formation, which leads to more urination. But since hydration is so very important when taking these medicines, there is that possibility of dehydration if we're not staying on top of that. The second fact versus fiction, this is the one where I almost think it almost sounds too good to be true, but there is definitely some scientific backing behind this, and we're still learning more. But cook and cool your rice overnight to cut calories. The answer to this is maybe there is something to this. When you cook and then cool rice overnight, safely, of course, so make sure it gets adequately cooled quickly enough, it causes the formation of resistant starch. We know this to be true. It's not that all of the rice becomes resistant starch, but a certain percentage of it does. Resistant starch is more difficult to break down, and resistant starch has a lower calorie load to it. However, when looking into the amount of calorie reduction, it does seem to be debatable. You'll hear some people report that it cuts it down by almost 50%. But there are some other people who've noticed maybe a 10-calorie difference. And so it may depend on the type of rice we're looking at. It may also depend on the quality of the research we're doing on the amount of resistant starch and how many calories that's contributing. It's an area that's very interesting to me, and I've been reading more and more about it. But even if the calorie reduction isn't that 50 to 60% that some people want to claim, just remember that there is a gut health benefit from the resistant starch formation. And so the fact that you're still getting healthier gut from doing that is something to focus on, especially if you are someone who enjoys rice with your food. And typically resistant starch can lead to people feeling a bit fuller for longer as well. And at long last, we're at the end here with the challenges for the week. So challenge number 1, try and add 1 complex carbohydrate to your day. Include at least 1 serving of a complex carb in one of your meals in the day, and just check in to see how that's doing for your energy levels. If you've had sandwiches that used white bread during your lunch, try something with whole wheat, whole grain, or have a quinoa salad, and see if that helps extend those energies so you don't get that afternoon slump. And if you feel like you've done pretty well with getting in enough complex carbs, then maybe we'll focus a little bit more specifically on the fiber content. The aim is for 25 to 38 grams of fiber a day. Try it for 3 days. Or, since many, many people do not get in that amount of fiber based on the American diet, just try to increase fiber for the day. And see how your fullness and digestive health or regularity works out from all of that. And so that would also be an area to sort of check in on and see how you feel from any amount of increase. By the way, if you need lists of complex carbohydrates or fiber-containing foods, by all means, you can reach out to me or the Premier Weight Loss staff. I'd be happy to provide you with lists of either or both, just to make sure that you've got all the information to help meet those challenges. To summarize overall, just remember carbohydrates are not the enemy, because we know that they do give us energy to burn throughout the day. There are plenty of carbohydrate foods that have essential nutrients for us, as well as fiber. But it is about the quality and getting in a balanced amount, not focusing it on the main event necessarily. And just remember, as always, Keeping sustainable weight management and sustainable techniques to manage our weight, it's about balance and not necessarily deprivation. So make sure that whatever changes you're making are sustainable and not about depriving yourself and feeling as though you cannot have something. Just balance it out. And with that, I open this time up to any questions or comments you may have. So feel free to press that question button at the bottom of your screen. I'll wait here for just a few minutes to see if any questions come in. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining today. And if any questions come up that you didn't have that you thought of later, by all means reach out to the Premier Weight Loss staff or myself. We're happy to answer them for you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and that you stay warm. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.